December 16th, 1944. The dense forests of the Ardennes were buried under heavy snow. Visibility was poor, the air thick with fog and frost. Temperatures plunged below freezing as German soldiers huddled around idling engines for warmth, the sound muffled by the endless expanse of white. At dawn, silence gave way to thunder. The German army unleashed a massive surprise offensive across the Western Front, Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. It was Adolf Hitler's final gamble. A desperate attempt to split the Allied lines, capture Antwerp, and force the Western powers into a negotiated peace. But behind the propaganda and bold strategy lay a brutal truth. Germany's fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. Entire panzer divisions were operating on fumes. Each tank, truck, and armored column depended on carefully rationed fuel that could barely sustain a few days of combat. Among the forces leading the charge was SS Colonel Joachim Peiper, commander of Kampfgruppe Peiper, a spearhead unit of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. His formation consisted of elite troops, Panthers and Tiger tanks, half-tracks, and self-propelled guns. One of the most powerful armored units remaining in the Reich's arsenal. Peiper's orders were simple, yet nearly impossible. Advance rapidly through the Ardennes, seize key road junctions, capture Allied supply depots, and secure the fuel his division desperately needed. Speed and surprise were their only advantages. The entire offensive hinged on one thing: fuel. Without it, even Germany's mightiest tanks would become steel coffins in the snow. As the offensive began, Peiper's column pushed west through the narrow, icy roads of the Ardennes. Engines roared, exhaust fumes mingled with mist, and tank treads chewed through frozen mud. For a moment, it seemed as though the plan might work, that Germany's last offensive could break through the Allied front. What no one in Peiper's column yet knew was that within 48 hours, they would stumble upon a discovery so shocking, so revealing, that it would strip away any illusion that Germany could still win this war. Joachim Peiper's column snaked through the frozen valleys of the Ardennes like a steel serpent. The roads were narrow, slick with ice, and clogged with vehicles. Panthers, Tigers, and half-tracks growled forward, their engines echoing through the trees. Exhaust smoke hung in the freezing air, blurring the outlines of the machines that carried the last hopes of the Third Reich. The advance was painfully slow. Snowdrifts swallowed the smaller vehicles. Supply trucks slipped into ditches. Fuel trucks, guarded like treasure, struggled to keep pace with the main armored columns. The frigid air bit into exposed skin, and the soldiers, many barely 20 years old, fought against both the enemy and the cold. Peiper knew that time was everything. Hitler's plan depended on speed. The longer the Germans took to reach the Meuse River, the greater the chance the Allies would regroup and crush the offensive. But the reality on the ground was far from the optimistic maps drawn in Hitler's headquarters. The Ardennes was a nightmare for armor. Trees grew thick and close together, and every turn risked an ambush. Bridges were narrow, sometimes collapsing under the weight of German tanks. American artillery occasionally rained down from unseen positions, scattering vehicles and cutting supply lines. Peiper's units still pressed on. Radio messages came in fragments, often distorted by the terrain. Reports told of American positions falling back faster than expected, of empty roads and abandoned villages. For a moment, it seemed like fortune was turning. Perhaps the Allies were panicking. Perhaps, just maybe, this offensive could change the course of the war. But behind the temporary success lurked an inescapable truth. Every kilometer gained cost fuel, and Germany had almost none to spare. Each tank that advanced burned the lifeblood of the entire operation. Every delay drained the reserves further. By the second day, Peiper's fuel situation was critical. He could not afford to stop, but he could not afford to run dry either. The plan relied on capturing Allied fuel depots along the way, a hope more than a strategy. And soon, that hope would materialize. On the morning of December 17th, Peiper's scouts spotted an American outpost ahead, a quiet Belgian village named Honsfeld. At first light on December the 17th, 1944, Peiper's armored column rolled into the quiet Belgian village of Honsfeld. The snow muffled every sound except the low growl of engines and the crunch of steel tracks on ice. Smoke drifted from chimneys, then disappeared as the villagers realized the Germans had arrived. American troops from the 99th Infantry Division had withdrawn only hours earlier, leaving behind what Peiper's men could scarcely believe. Rows of abandoned jeeps, trucks, and fuel drums stacked beside the road. It was as if the retreating enemy had vanished mid-operation. Peiper ordered his men to secure the area. The Waffen-SS fanned out through the town, rounding up stragglers, checking houses, and sweeping the nearby fields. In one corner of the village, they found it, the prize every German tanker dreamed of. Inside an unguarded depot sat around 50,000 gallons of American gasoline. For the fuel-starved Germans, it felt like a miracle. Mechanics rushed to siphon and pump the fuel into every usable vehicle. Tank crews filled their reserves to the brim. Engines that had sputtered for lack of fuel now roared back to life. The column's mobility was restored, at least for the moment. But amid the celebration, Peiper felt something darker. The sheer amount of gasoline left behind stunned him. He realized that the Americans could afford to abandon more fuel in one small village than his entire division might receive in months. Germany's armies were scraping the bottom of the barrel, while the Allies were drowning in resources. Still, there was no time for reflection. Peiper's orders were to push west, seize bridges, and keep the offensive moving. He knew the gift of Honsfeld would not last forever. Every mile of advance would burn through their newfound treasure. As the last barrels were emptied, and the depot set ablaze to deny it to any pursuers, the column rolled out once more. Tanks heavy with fuel, and soldiers unaware they had just witnessed a symbol of Germany's impending defeat. Fueled up and confident, Kampfgruppe Peiper surged westward out of Honsfeld. The tanks roared back to life, tracks biting into the snow, as exhaust plumes drifted into the freezing air. For the first time in days, Peiper's men felt unstoppable. Their vehicles were full, their morale restored, and the fog of uncertainty briefly lifted. But the Ardennes was no easy battleground. The roads were narrow, twisting through forests and small villages. Many were mined or blocked by wreckage from earlier fights. As Peiper's column advanced, they encountered burnt-out vehicles, frozen corpses, and evidence of American resistance regrouping ahead. Each obstacle cost time, and every minute lost burned precious fuel. The Americans, though surprised at first, were recovering quickly. Roadblocks, artillery ambushes, and scattered infantry delayed the Germans at every turn. Snowstorms reduced visibility, and the Luftwaffe could no longer provide cover. Peiper's radio crackled with constant updates. Bridges destroyed, supply convoys stuck, paths too narrow for tanks. Despite the growing chaos, Peiper pushed his men relentlessly. He knew that the success of the entire Battle of the Bulge depended on spearheads, like his reaching the Meuse River before Allied reinforcements arrived. He couldn't afford hesitation. If his unit stopped, the offensive could collapse behind him. Fuel drums from Honsfeld were now almost empty again. Mechanics followed in trucks carrying the last reserves, calculating every kilometer of movement. Soldiers began to understand the grim math. Each advance meant another ration of gasoline gone, and there were no new depots ahead. The victory at Honsfeld had bought them only time, not triumph. Still, Peiper refused to show doubt. His command vehicle led the way through snow and wreckage, past silent villages and frozen forests. In his mind, the offensive still had a chance. If they could keep moving, just a little further west, they might yet change the course of the war. He was wrong. What waited beyond the next ridge would not be another victory, but the beginning of a brutal realization. Germany could no longer outfight an enemy that could outproduce it. By the evening of December 18th, the illusion of momentum began to fade. Kampfgruppe Peiper was still moving, but slower and with increasing desperation. The forest roads that had seemed like corridors to victory were now turning into traps of mud, snow, and broken machinery. Peiper's Panthers and Tigers were engineering marvels. Thick armor, massive guns, terrifying presence. But they were also heavy, fuel-hungry beasts. Every kilometer forward came at a cost measured not in bullets, but in liters of gasoline. Mechanics worked through the freezing night, transferring fuel between vehicles, scavenging parts, and cannibalizing damaged tanks just to keep the column rolling. The German High Command had gambled everything on this offensive. They believed speed would compensate for weakness, that shock and aggression could make up for shortages. But the truth was brutal. Germany's logistical system was collapsing. Refineries bombed by the Allies were no longer producing enough to sustain the army. Supply lines stretched from deep inside the Reich to the front, constantly harassed by Allied air patrols. As Peiper's men advanced, they could see the contrast in every village they entered. Abandoned American positions were filled with well-stocked rations, ammunition, fuel drums, warm uniforms, and spare parts. The sheer abundance was overwhelming, a reminder that the enemy was fighting a different kind of war, one powered by industrial giants across the Atlantic. The Americans could replace what they lost. The Germans could not. For every Tiger tank rolling through the snow, the Allies could field dozens of Shermans. For every German convoy that ran out of fuel, the US Army could send hundreds of trucks from depots deep inside France. Peiper understood this imbalance, though he never said it aloud. The war had become a contest not of courage or tactics, but of production. And production was something Germany could no longer win. As his men rested beside idling tanks, their breath fogging the frozen air, Peiper looked westward. Ahead lay Stavelot, Trois Ponts, and the bridges to the Meuse. His orders were clear, but his instincts told him what Berlin refused to admit. The German army was running on hope, and hope doesn't move tanks. By the third day of the offensive, the element of surprise was gone. The Americans, caught off guard at first, had begun to reorganize with astonishing speed. What had started as confusion now turned into resistance. Columns of American armor and infantry poured into the Ardennes, blocking crossroads and cutting off supply routes. Peiper's men first encountered serious resistance near the small towns east of Stavelot. US engineers blew up bridges before the Germans could cross, forcing detours that cost hours. Artillery shells began to fall with deadly precision, guided by spotters hidden in the snow-covered hills. What was supposed to be a lightning advance turned into a slow, grinding struggle. The 1st SS Panzer Division was trained for aggression, not defense. Peiper's men fought with discipline and determination, but they were fighting an enemy that seemed to appear everywhere at once. American soldiers, though cold and exhausted, were backed by endless supplies. Fresh ammunition, food, fuel, and reinforcements. German vehicles began to run dry again. The fuel captured at Honsfeld was nearly gone, burned up by long detours and constant skirmishes. Trucks that couldn't move were abandoned. The Panther tanks that had terrified Allied troops now stood silent, their engines dead, and their crews waiting helplessly in the cold. Peiper himself remained calm, but furious. He knew the offensive's success depended on momentum, and momentum was slipping away. Reports came in that other German spearheads were stalled, blocked by blown bridges, or running out of fuel entirely. The grand vision of cutting through to the Meuse River was fading fast. Still, Peiper pressed on. His men captured Stavelot, but holding it proved impossible. American counterattacks struck from multiple directions. The battle turned into chaos. Snow, smoke, and fire blending together as both sides fought yard by yard. By the end of the day, the roads behind Peiper's column were clogged with wrecks. His radio operators could barely reach headquarters. What had begun as a bold thrust into Allied lines was now becoming an isolated struggle for survival. The Americans had regrouped, and Peiper's once unstoppable spearhead was slowly being surrounded, cut off from the rest of the German army, trapped in a blizzard of artillery, and burning through its last drops of fuel. By December 19th, Peiper's once proud spearhead was running on fumes, literally. The snow kept falling, blanketing the Ardennes in silence, broken only by distant artillery. Inside the tanks, crews shivered beside silent engines, conserving what little fuel remained. Some vehicles were abandoned altogether, their crews squeezed into others to save gasoline. The roads behind them were now under American control. The bridges Peiper needed had been destroyed, and reinforcements could no longer reach him. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the tip of the German counterattack, was now cut off behind enemy lines. Still, the men fought. They defended every crossroads and village they occupied, trading shells and rifle fire with advancing American units. Peiper's leadership kept morale intact, even as ammunition dwindled and food ran out. They were surrounded, but not yet broken. At night, the Ardennes turned into a frozen graveyard. Tank crews slept inside their machines, using engine heat to survive. Infantry dug shallow foxholes in the snow, their rifles frozen to their gloves. The temperature dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. For many soldiers, frostbite was as deadly as enemy fire. Peiper ordered strict fuel rationing. Only tanks involved in combat could run their engines. Others were parked and drained, their fuel redistributed among the vehicles still mobile. Mechanics worked silently under the moonlight, transferring fuel line by line. Every drop mattered. The Americans tightened the noose. Sherman tanks and armored cars blocked every escape route, and artillery pounded the roads day and night. Allied aircraft, grounded by weather early in the battle, now returned as skies cleared. P-47 Thunderbolts strafed columns, turning stalled vehicles into fireballs. The proud formation that had begun the offensive as the Reich's finest armored unit was now isolated, hungry and freezing, surrounded by an enemy that had more men, more tanks, and an endless flow of supplies. Peiper's men didn't yet know it, but their campaign through the Ardennes was nearing its end. The last of their fuel was nearly gone, and every explosion in the distance meant another tank, and another hope had just burned out. By the night of December 20th, Peiper's column was fighting not for victory, but for escape. The once orderly advance had turned into a desperate brawl through burning towns and collapsing villages. The Ardennes was lit by fire, not from victory celebrations, but from fuel depots, destroyed tanks, and the wreckage of a collapsing offensive. Peiper's men held their ground in Stoumont and Gleize, two small Belgian villages that now stood at the center of the struggle. Every street became a battlefield. Panthers fired point-blank at American Shermans. Infantry battled from windows and cellars. Mortar shells shattered rooftops, sending snow and debris raining down. The Americans attacked relentlessly, backed by armor, artillery, and air power. Their supply trucks roared up behind the lines, bringing ammunition and fuel, while German soldiers rationed every bullet. Each time Peiper's men repelled an attack, another came within the hour. The Allied pressure was constant, overwhelming. Fuel was now measured not in barrels, but in minutes of engine time. Peiper ordered vehicles to remain stationary unless absolutely necessary. Tanks were hidden inside barns or behind walls to save what little fuel remained. Crews stripped frozen corpses of ammunition, scavenged food from destroyed American trucks, and waited for orders that no longer came. For the villages, it was hell on earth. Fire lit up the night sky as homes burned and artillery tore through the snow-covered roofs. The roads were littered with twisted wrecks, German and American alike, frozen monuments to a battle that had already lost its purpose. Peiper tried to maintain communication with headquarters, but radio silence dominated. The chain of command had disintegrated. He was on his own, deep behind enemy lines, with hundreds of men, dozens of tanks, and no hope of resupply. By December 22nd, the reality was clear. Kampfgruppe Peiper was surrounded. No reinforcements would break through the American lines. The snowstorm had cleared, and Allied aircraft now ruled the skies. Every road out of Gleize was covered in wreckage and burning fuel. The soldiers looked to their commander for answers, but even Peiper's eyes betrayed exhaustion. He had once believed this offensive could change the war. Now, as the fires of Gleize reflected off the armor of his stranded tanks, he knew the battle was no longer about victory. It was about survival. By December 23, 1944, Kampfgruppe Peiper was running on the last drops of its captured fuel. The barrels from Honsfeld were long empty, and the tanks that had once symbolized German strength now sat motionless in the snow, cold, silent, and useless. The men drained every stalled vehicle, transferring fuel line by line to keep a few Panthers and half-tracks operational. Mechanics worked with numb hands, scraping ice from fuel caps and patching holes in the snow. The engines coughed, sputtered, and finally came alive one last time, their growl echoing through the dead forest. Peiper gathered his officers in a small farmhouse outside Gleize. The mood was grim. They had only enough fuel for one final push, a breakout attempt to reach German lines to the east. The plan was simple but desperate. Move by night, strike fast, and pray the Americans wouldn't expect an attack from a force that was supposed to be finished. The last convoy rolled out through narrow lanes choked with snow and wreckage. Tanks led the way, followed by half-tracks carrying wounded soldiers. Every headlight was darkened, every sound muffled. The men knew what was at stake. If the engine stopped, they would freeze, or be captured. But the Americans were ready. Roadblocks guarded every route, and artillery zeroed in on the few exits from the valley. As the German column approached, flares lit up the night sky, turning the forest into a frozen inferno. Shells crashed into trees and vehicles. Panthers exploded, sending flames through the snow. The breakout stalled within minutes. Peiper's tanks were trapped, pinned down by overwhelming firepower. One by one, vehicles were hit and abandoned. Crews escaped on foot, disappearing into the dark woods, carrying their rifles and leaving their machines behind. By dawn, it was over. The last of Peiper's tanks had burned out in the snow. Their fuel gone, their engines silent, monuments to an army that could no longer move. Peiper and his surviving men retreated into the forests around Gleize, cut off completely, surrounded by an enemy that controlled the air, the ground, and the future. For Peiper, the truth was undeniable. The discovery at Honsfeld, the 50,000 gallons of American fuel that had once seemed like salvation, had become a cruel reminder. It showed him not how close Germany was to victory, but how far they were from ever achieving it. By December 24th, 1944, Gleize was a graveyard of steel. The snow was blackened by oil and ash, and the wrecks of panthers and tigers lay frozen where they'd fallen. Kampfgruppe Peiper, once the spearhead of Hitler's final offensive, was finished. Peiper's headquarters sat inside a small stone house near the center of the ruined village. The building shook with every distant artillery blast. His officers gathered inside, cold, exhausted, and out of options. The last reports confirmed what everyone already knew. No reinforcements were coming. The German lines were miles away, and the Americans had completely surrounded them. Peiper listened in silence, staring at a map covered in soot and bloodstains. For days he had fought to keep his men moving, hoping for a miracle that never came. Now, even hope was gone. They had no fuel, no ammunition, and no way out. Staying meant death or capture. That night, Peiper made the only decision left. He ordered all heavy vehicles destroyed, every panther, tiger, and half-track that still stood. Mechanics went from tank to tank, setting demolition charges and draining the last of the oil. At midnight, the sky above Gleize lit up as dozens of tanks exploded, their flames rising into the winter sky like the final funeral pyre of the German offensive. The next morning, Peiper assembled his remaining men, around 800 soldiers, many wounded and frostbitten. They carried what weapons they could and began marching east through snow that reached their knees. The forest swallowed them as they moved in silence, leaving behind the burning ruins of Gleize. They walked for miles, avoiding American patrols, crossing frozen rivers, and sleeping in barns and trenches. Some froze to death along the way. Others were captured or killed. But Peiper refused to surrender. For him, surrender was unthinkable, not out of pride, but because it would mean admitting what he had already realized. Germany's war was lost. On December 25th, Peiper survivors finally reached German lines. Barely half of them were still alive. They were welcomed not with celebration, but with silence. The offensive had failed. The dream of splitting the Allied front had died in the snow of Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge was not over yet, but for Kampfgruppe Peiper, and for the myth of German invincibility, it was the end. When Peiper crossed back into German-held territory, he wasn't greeted as a hero. He was met with disbelief. The once proud commander of Hitler's elite 1st SS Panzer Division had returned with nothing but the remnants of his men. His tanks, his vehicles, his supplies, all gone, buried in the snow of the Ardennes. In the days that followed, reports of the offensive's collapse poured in. The grand counterattack that Hitler had promised would turn the tide of the war had failed. Instead of splitting the Allies, the Wehrmacht had bled itself dry. Thousands of soldiers were dead or captured. Hundreds of tanks lay destroyed. The last of Germany's fuel reserves had been wasted in an offensive that achieved nothing. Peiper was summoned for debriefing. He spoke plainly, not as a fanatic, but as a soldier who had seen the truth firsthand. He described how his men had captured 50,000 gallons of American fuel at Honsfeld, and yet realized, even then, that Germany's defeat was inevitable. The Americans could abandon more fuel in one small village than the German army could supply to an entire division in months. That moment had shattered him. It wasn't the loss of the battle that haunted Peiper, it was the realization of what the war had become. Germany was fighting an enemy that could replace everything it lost. Every tank destroyed, every plane shot down, every shell fired. All could be rebuilt, replaced, and multiplied. The Reich was no longer fighting a war. It was enduring a slow, mechanical extinction. Historians later called it the Logistics War, a conflict decided not in the skies or trenches, but in factories and refineries thousands of miles away. The United States had produced more than 1.8 billion barrels of oil during the war. Germany, crippled by bombings and a lack of resources, barely managed 33 million. It wasn't courage or tactics that would decide the outcome. It was numbers. Peiper would later tell fellow officers that the depot at Honsfeld was the worst thing that could have happened. It didn't save them. It exposed them. It revealed that the Reich's might, once built on speed and precision, had been crushed by the simple arithmetic of industrial war. In that frozen Belgian village, surrounded by abundance, he understood it at last. The Third Reich wasn't losing because of strategy or leadership. It was losing because it had already run out of fuel, time, and reality. By late 1944, the German war machine was collapsing under its own weight. What had once been a finely tuned engine of conquest was now choking on shortages, bombings, and exhaustion. The industrial empire that had fueled years of war was coming apart. One refinery, one train line, one city at a time. Allied bombers had reduced the Reich's fuel network to ruins. Synthetic oil plants at Leuna, Pölitz, and Blechhammer were bombed relentlessly. Day after day, waves of flying fortresses and Lancasters pounded the refineries that had once produced the lifeblood of German armor. By autumn, production had fallen to less than a third of what it was a year earlier. The results were catastrophic. Panzer divisions sat immobilized, Luftwaffe aircraft were grounded, and training flights nearly stopped altogether. Tank crews practiced maneuvers without engines running. Pilots trained in gliders because there was no fuel for real aircraft. Germany was no longer fighting on the battlefield. It was suffocating in its own logistics. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American industry ran at full throttle. Oil convoys sailed continuously from Texas and the Caribbean to supply the Allied armies in Europe. Refineries in the US were producing fuel faster than the German army could consume it. For every gallon the Wehrmacht scraped together, the Allies produced hundreds. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago built tanks, planes, and trucks on a scale the Germans could not even imagine. Assembly lines ran day and night, workers replacing what the front destroyed before the week was over. The numbers were staggering. Over 88,000 tanks, 300,000 aircraft, and over 2 million trucks poured into the war. Germany's soldiers still fought fiercely, but they were fighting against a system that could not be beaten by courage alone. No amount of tactical brilliance could overcome a fuel shortage. No strategy could change the math of production. By December, even Hitler's generals knew the truth. They could plan operations, move symbols on a map, and talk of breakthroughs. But without fuel, those symbols were nothing. Peiper's failed breakout was just one story among thousands. Stories of stalled tanks, silent planes, and soldiers walking home through the snow because the Reich had literally run dry. The offensive in the Ardennes had not just burned the last of Germany's gasoline. It had burned away the last illusion that the war could still be won. While German troops froze in the forests of Belgium, the American war machine never slept. Across the Atlantic, factories, shipyards, and oil refineries were working around the clock. The United States had become what Roosevelt once called the arsenal of democracy. In 1944 alone, the US produced enough fuel to power every Allied tank, aircraft, and truck in Europe, and still have reserves to spare. Convoys of Liberty ships crossed the Atlantic filled with gasoline, ammunition, food, and spare parts. From ports in England and France, rivers of supply trucks stretched across Europe, the Red Ball Express, delivering millions of gallons of fuel each day to the front lines. The scale was unimaginable to German commanders. While the Wehrmacht struggled to find enough gasoline for a single division, the Americans were burning fuel by the millions of gallons, not because they were careless, but because they could. For them, logistics wasn't a weakness, it was the weapon. Every Sherman tank that rolled forward had a dozen trucks behind it, carrying fuel, shells, and food. Every air raid over Germany was supported by tankers, depots, and airfields that could replace lost aircraft in days. American bombers could drop thousands of tons of explosives daily because their refueling network stretched from Britain to Africa to the Persian Gulf. For Peiper, this difference had become painfully clear at Honsfeld. He had seen the abandoned American fuel, the sheer waste of it, and realized it wasn't waste at all. It was proof of dominance. The US could afford to abandon what Germany could no longer dream of producing. By the winter of 1944, the Allied armies weren't just stronger. They were practically unstoppable. They could move anywhere, anytime, powered by an industrial system that spanned continents. Oil, steel, rubber, and manpower, all feeding a war effort that had turned into a machine. Germany's tanks could still fight, its soldiers could still die bravely, but they were outmatched by something far greater than courage: the mathematics of production. For every tank the Reich built, the Allies built 10. For every liter of gasoline they saved, the Americans produced 1,000. And that was the truth Peiper had seen too late. The battle for Europe wasn't being won on the snowy roads of the Ardennes. It was being won in the refineries, factories, and shipyards half a world away. By the end of December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge was collapsing. What had begun as Hitler's final gamble was turning into a catastrophe. The German advance had stalled, and the snow-covered fields of Belgium were littered with wrecks, proof that courage alone could not win a mechanized war. The Allies, now fully regrouped, struck back with overwhelming force. Fresh divisions poured into the Ardennes, backed by armor, artillery, and endless supplies. The skies cleared, and once again, Allied aircraft dominated. Columns of P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons hunted German convoys, shredding them from the air. Roads became graveyards of burnt-out tanks and trucks. Inside Germany, factories could no longer keep up. Bombing raids had crippled transportation networks, fuel depots, and rail lines. What little could still be produced often never reached the front. Every kilometer of ground gained in the Ardennes now cost the Wehrmacht dearly, not just in men, but in machinery they could never replace. Meanwhile, the Americans and British moved with a confidence that came from abundance. They could lose tanks and replace them within days. They could launch offensives without worrying about fuel or spare parts. For the first time since 1939, Germany's enemies weren't reacting. They were dictating the pace of war. The Ardennes offensive had one last brutal consequence. It destroyed what remained of Germany's mobile reserves. Thousands of tanks, vehicles, and soldiers that might have defended the Reich in 1945 were lost in this final, doomed gamble. When the snows melted in spring, the Allies would face almost no resistance as they crossed the Rhine. For Hitler, the failure of the Bulge was more than a defeat. It was the death of his vision. He had believed that one last strike could fracture the Allied coalition and force a political solution. Instead, it had united them stronger than ever. And for Peiper, it was personal. He had seen firsthand how the enemy's strength no longer came from the battlefield, but from the system behind it. The endless supply lines, the factories, the refineries, the manpower of a nation untouched by war at home. When his men trudged back through the Ardennes snow, leaving their tanks behind, it wasn't just the end of one battle. It was the moment the German army crossed from offense to survival, from fighting for victory to fighting for time. The Battle of the Bulge left Germany bleeding. In just 6 weeks, the Wehrmacht lost more than 100,000 men, thousands of vehicles, and the last of its armored reserves. What Hitler had promised as a turning point became a death sentence for the German army. Entire divisions ceased to exist. Tanks were abandoned where they froze, and officers reported units that had simply vanished in the snow. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of German power, barely appeared in the skies, starved of fuel, outnumbered, and overwhelmed by Allied fighters. For the soldiers who survived, the defeat in the Ardennes broke something deeper than morale. Many had believed that this final offensive could somehow change the tide, that if they could just hold out long enough, the Western Allies might turn on the Soviets, or negotiations might begin. But when the offensive collapsed, so did those illusions. Even the most loyal SS officers could see the truth. The Reich was finished. There would be no miracle weapon, no second wind, no chance to recover. The enemy was too vast, too industrial, too rich in resources. Germany's dream of domination had been crushed by the sheer weight of production and logistics. Peiper's Kampfgruppe had been destroyed. Of the 5,000 men who began the offensive under his command, fewer than half made it back. Every tank and vehicle he had led into Belgium had been lost. He had captured thousands of gallons of American fuel, but it had changed nothing. It was like pouring a glass of water into a burning forest. The price of the Ardennes gamble was more than just equipment and lives. It was the last remnants of strategic credibility. The Allies now saw Germany as a dying force, and they pressed forward with renewed determination. Within 3 months, the Western Front would collapse entirely. In January 1945, Hitler still ranted of counterattacks and new divisions, but his generals knew better. There was nothing left to counter with. The factories were silent, the trains weren't running, and the soldiers were exhausted. The Battle of the Bulge had not only failed, it had accelerated Germany's defeat. It drained the last of their strength, burned their final fuel, and left the Reich staring into the abyss. And for men like Joachim Peiper, it was the moment the war turned from duty into tragedy. They weren't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting because surrender was worse. While the Ardennes froze under Allied control, the real disaster was already unfolding hundreds of miles away, in the east. As Germany bled itself dry in Belgium, the Soviet Red Army gathered for a final, unstoppable push into the heart of Europe. In January 1945, barely weeks after Peiper's shattered column limped home, Operation Vistula Oder began. Over 2.2 million Soviet soldiers, backed by 6,000 tanks and 40,000 guns, launched a massive assault across Poland. The German lines crumbled almost immediately. Entire divisions vanished under the weight of artillery and armor. There was no fuel to move reserves, no aircraft to provide cover, and no time to regroup. Hitler had poured his last mobile units, including Peiper's, into the Ardennes. What was left to defend the east were teenage recruits, Volkssturm militias, and broken remnants of divisions destroyed in the west. In less than a month, the Red Army advanced more than 300 miles. They reached the Oder River, just 70 kilometers from Berlin. The Reich that had once stretched across Europe was now collapsing inward, its heart exposed. Inside Hitler's bunker, reports of the Ardennes defeat mixed with the news from the east. The Führer raged and blamed everyone, his generals, his allies, even the weather. But deep down, those still loyal to him knew the truth. Germany had lost both fronts because it had lost its ability to fight a modern war. Fuel shortages that had stalled Peiper's tanks in Belgium now crippled entire armies in the east. Panzer divisions couldn't redeploy, aircraft were grounded, and transport lines had collapsed. What had happened on the snowy roads of the Ardennes was now happening on a continental scale, an entire empire running out of motion. As Soviet forces captured Warsaw, Krakow, and Königsberg, German soldiers retreating westward spoke of chaos and despair. Villages burned, refugees flooded the roads, and the once disciplined Wehrmacht turned into a desperate mass of survivors. The collapse of the Eastern Front sealed the fate of the Reich. The Battle of the Bulge had not just been Germany's last offensive. It had been its final distraction. While Hitler gambled everything in the West, The Red Army took the east. And now the war was closing in from both directions. The question was no longer if Germany would fall, but when. By February 1945, Germany was dying. Not in one place, but everywhere at once. The great cities that had once been symbols of power now lay in ruins. Berlin, Cologne, and Dresden burned under relentless Allied bombing. The streets were filled with refugees, the wounded, and the hopeless. Factories that once fed the German war machine stood silent, their roofs torn open by bombs. Railways were shattered, bridges collapsed, and rivers of refugees clogged the countryside. Entire industries had ceased to function. Even the most loyal officers knew the truth. The Reich had run out of everything: fuel, ammunition, soldiers, and time. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now a memory. Most of its pilots were dead, its aircraft destroyed or grounded for lack of fuel. The skies over Germany belonged entirely to the Allies. Bombers flew in daylight without fear. The army was no better. Units that had fought in France and Russia were gone. Teenagers, old men, and wounded veterans now stood in their place. The once proud panzer divisions that had stormed across Europe were ghosts, skeleton crews with barely functioning tanks. Hitler still refused to surrender. From his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, he issued orders to divisions that no longer existed and demanded counterattacks from armies that could barely move. His generals, trapped between duty and despair, obeyed commands that made no sense. The fantasy of victory persisted, even as the country collapsed around them. In the west, Allied forces crossed the Rhine. In the east, the Red Army closed in on Berlin. Germany was now a shrinking island in a sea of enemies. Every kilometer lost brought the war closer to the capital. For the soldiers who had survived the Ardennes, the final months felt unreal. They had seen the last offensive fail, the last reserves burn out, and now they were fighting in a war that no longer had purpose, only momentum. Joachim Peiper, once the embodiment of Germany's armored might, watched it all unravel. He had seen the truth in Belgium, that no army, no matter how disciplined or determined, could survive without the machines and resources to sustain it. The defeat in the Ardennes wasn't just military, it was symbolic. It marked the moment Germany stopped fighting for victory and started fighting to delay defeat. By the spring of 1945, delay was all that remained. By April 1945, the war had come home to Berlin. The city that once ruled Europe was now a fortress of rubble and fire. Soviet artillery thundered from the east, shaking the ground day and night. The skyline glowed red, not from victory parades, but from burning buildings and collapsing streets. Millions of civilians were trapped inside the city. Families, refugees, wounded soldiers, and children too young to understand the noise that surrounded them. Food was gone, water was scarce, and electricity flickered only in short bursts. The once mighty capital of the Reich had become a tomb. The Red Army, led by Marshals Zhukov and Konev, encircled Berlin from 3 sides. More than 2.5 million Soviet troops advanced with brutal determination. For them, this was revenge. For Leningrad, for Stalingrad, for 4 years of blood and fire. The defenders of Berlin were a shadow of an army. Old men of the Volkssturm, Hitler Youth carrying Panzerfausts, and the remnants of broken divisions took up positions in the ruins. They fought from basements, subway tunnels, and shattered buildings, knowing there was nowhere left to retreat. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler refused to face reality. He issued orders to armies that no longer existed, demanded counterattacks from divisions long destroyed, and spoke of salvation that would never come. Around him, the world was ending. His generals whispered of surrender, but he called them traitors. On the surface, Soviet troops fought street by street, block by block. Tanks blasted through barricades, snipers hunted from the shadows, and artillery pounded the Reichstag, the heart of Nazi power. Every corner of the city became a battleground. By April 30th, it was over. Soviet soldiers stormed the Reichstag and raised the red flag over the ruins. In the bunker below, Adolf Hitler took his own life. The Third Reich, once believed eternal, had fallen, buried beneath the rubble it had created. When the guns finally fell silent on May 8, 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Cities destroyed, millions dead, and a continent scarred forever. For men like Joachim Peiper, the end was not a surprise. It had been inevitable since that day in Honsfeld, when he realized the truth. Germany hadn't lost because its soldiers were weak or its leaders made mistakes. It had lost because it fought a war it could no longer afford to fight. The fall of Berlin wasn't just the end of a regime. It was the final echo of a world consumed by its own ambition. When the guns fell silent, the world began to count the cost. Europe lay in ruins, divided between victors who had paid in blood and an enemy crushed by its own delusion. The war was over. But for men like Joachim Peiper, the reckoning had only begun. Peiper and what remained of his unit were captured by American forces in the spring of 1945. Word of his name had already spread through Allied ranks. He was infamous, not only as one of the Waffen-SS's youngest commanders, but also as the man linked to one of the war's most brutal incidents, the Malmedy Massacre, where American prisoners of war had been executed during the Ardennes campaign. Peiper denied ordering the killings, but the stain of the event followed him. During the Malmedy trials in 1946, he and several of his officers were sentenced to death. Later, many of the sentences were reduced after evidence emerged of forced confessions and irregular interrogations. Peiper's punishment was commuted to life imprisonment, and after more than a decade behind bars, he was released in 1956. He tried to rebuild a life in post-war Germany, quiet, obscure, far removed from the glory and fire of his youth. But his past never left him. To some Germans, he was a soldier who had done his duty. To others, a symbol of the crimes committed in the name of the Reich. In the 1970s, Peiper moved to a small village in France, seeking solitude. But even there, his history caught up with him. In 1976, his house was set ablaze by unknown attackers. Peiper was trapped inside. His body was found among the ashes, the last commander of the Ardennes offensive consumed by fire, as if history itself had come to close the chapter he began. For historians, Peiper's story became more than the tale of a single man. It was a mirror of Germany's war, bold, ruthless, efficient, and ultimately doomed. He had been a product of a system that demanded everything and gave nothing back. The captured fuel at Honsfeld, the destroyed tanks at Gleize, and the fire that ended his life all carried the same message. Power without conscience always burns itself out. The war that Peiper fought had promised glory and empire. What it delivered was ruin and memory. A lesson carved into the snow of the Ardennes and the ruins of Berlin. The story of Joachim Peiper isn't just about one man. It's the story of a nation that believed speed, power, and willpower could overcome reality. For a time, it did. German tanks tore through Europe. Luftwaffe bombers ruled the skies, and the world watched in awe. But in the end, the same engines that carried the Reich to victory became the symbols of its downfall. When Peiper's tanks rolled into Honsfeld and found those 50,000 gallons of American fuel, it seemed like salvation. But in truth, it was revelation. It exposed the enormous gap between Germany's ambition and America's capacity. It proved that no matter how skilled the soldier, or how advanced the weapon, war in the modern age was not won by bravery, but by industry. The Battle of the Bulge marked the last time the German army ever went on the offensive. After that, the Reich never again had the strength to strike back. The forests of the Ardennes became the grave of Hitler's final dream, and the birthplace of a new world order built on logistics, not ideology. Peiper's story lives on as a symbol of contrast. Human courage trapped within a collapsing system. He was not unique. Millions on every side fought, suffered, and believed they were serving something greater. But the lesson his life leaves behind is universal. No empire, no matter how powerful, can survive once it runs out of the truth that sustains it. For Germany, that truth was industrial reality. For Peiper, it was the moment he realized that courage could no longer fill a fuel tank, and discipline could not replace gasoline. When historians look back on the Ardennes offensive, they see more than a battle. They see the moment when two worlds collided. One fighting with desperation, the other with production. And in that collision, the outcome of the entire war was sealed. Today, Rusted wrecks of Panthers and Shermans still lie buried in Belgian forests, silent witnesses to the winter of 1944. They remind us that history is not just written in victories, but in the cost of chasing them. And, for Peiper, the man who saluted his enemy and saw the truth too late, that winter in the Ardennes was not just the end of a battle. It was the end of an era,